Hi everyone, I'm Justin, and I'm here to present a little something called the Game Jam Survival Guide. So welcome everyone. For reference, this is going to be roughly a 40-minute presentation with time after for questions, I believe. So I guess if you need to keep that in mind for however you're preparing for the jam, there you go. So hi again. Some of you may actually remember me from the Learnathon that was earlier this year. To anyone who does, hi again. Honestly, it's great to be back, and thank you to Kurius for inviting me again. It's an honor. For those of you who don't know, I'm a game designer at Ubisoft, currently working on Rainbow Six Siege. Before that, I worked on Hyperscape, and before that, I worked in mobile and indie for a while. But more relevant to this particular talk, I've done a few game jams. Well, more than a few. Actually, to be honest, I've kind of lost track of how many I've done. What you see on the screen right now isn't even an exhaustive list. I've done quite a few more than these. These are just the ones that really have something I can show. Some of the jams turned out great, some really terribly. I've won some jams, I've lost quite a few more, and I've learned a lot. So that's why I can genuinely say with confidence that game jams are awesome. Game jams, hackathons, whatever you want to call them, they're genuinely a fantastic way to develop your skills. The experience you gain, the friends you make, the trials you overcome are basically like speed training for a career in games or any sort of development. Not to mention, they can genuinely be a lot of fun. Honestly, I can't recommend them enough. So to those of you who are participating in KuriusHacks, good on you. And for those that aren't and who are just here, I guess, I definitely recommend it when you get the chance. They are just a great way to speedrun so many things. That said, game jams can also be pretty intimidating, especially if it's your first time. So there's a lot to take in, and there's a lot that can go wrong. With that in mind, I've prepared a few tips to not only help you survive, but thrive in a game jam environment, from start to finish. So with that, let's start at the start. Even before the start, before you even start your game jam, there are some things worth keeping in mind. So if I'm not mistaken, you've already started this jam yesterday. So some of these might be a bit late for you, but it's worth keeping in mind for future jams, and some of them you can kind of do retroactively, so I guess maybe this is still useful information. My first piece of advice is balance your team. The single most important part of your jam is your team. It doesn't matter what the theme is or what the challenges or resources you might have are if your team isn't built properly. There's multiple facets to that. The first, of course, is your roles. Ideally, you want a team of people who can each specialize in a certain part of the work, with a bit of flexibility to help out with other parts as needed. Generally speaking, in a 5 to 6 person team, you want a distribution that's roughly like this. So you would have 1 to 2 artists, 1 to 2 programmers, 1 design/project manager/flex role that can kind of go into a bunch of different kind of extra things. And optionally, if you want to have some really nice audio, then you get 1 musician or audio designer. In this kind of setup, it's easiest to stack artists and programmers, because you can have many artists and programmers on a single team, and they'll have more than enough work between them without stepping on each other's toes. With just about everything else, 1 is usually more than enough, so you don't really need more than 1 designer. Now, that's not to say you can't do a game jam with only designers or only programmers or some other weird distribution. However, you will have a much easier experience if you keep things balanced. And I can say that from experience. In fact, I did do a game jam where we had only designers, no one knew any art, and I was pretty much the only person on the team that had some programming knowledge. And, well, let's just say you might be able to tell that we didn't have an artist on our team, because that's kind of the look that we put out by the end. So, not to say you can't do it, just bear in mind if you're looking to win a jam, it's good to have that balance. It also saves you on a lot of extra stress of someone suddenly having to learn a tool last minute. Next up, be aligned with your team. So, roles aren't the only type of balance to consider when thinking about your team. It's also important to consider what your goals and methodologies are. There's no wrong way to do a game jam, let me be clear. So, if you're doing it for whatever reason, they're all valid. But it's best to figure out what everyone on the team wants out of the jam before diving in. So, for example, if you're just there to participate casually and practice your coding skills, that's fine. That's perfectly within your right. But then, if the rest of your team is looking to aggressively compete and try and get that top spot, you might find yourself mismatched. So, it's best to figure out these types of intentions early. That way, you don't end up with shattered expectations or bad blood within the team. And you definitely don't want bad blood in the team. That is just not good. Have your tools ready. So you'd be surprised at how many people come to a game jam without the equipment that they'll actually need to participate. This is, of course, a bigger deal if you're physically attending a venue and you're not doing the jam remotely, which I'm assuming most of you guys are. But it can apply then as well. Make sure you have all or most of the software and hardware that you'll potentially need for your roles in the jam. So if, for example, you're a programmer, it might help to have your game engine. So say you're using Unity, maybe have Unity installed before you start the jam. It's generally a good idea. Because you don't want to spend the first couple hours of your jam just installing stuff, or in some cases, I remember I've seen people go to game jams and not even bring their computer, which I have to wonder why. But some people just kind of don't think of it, or they have some other plan. But my recommendation is have that stuff before you start the jam. As a team, it's also a good idea to come up with a few standard ways to communicate and share files before you start working. If nothing else, make sure you have a default way to contact each other for emergencies. You'll never know when you need it. So at least have each other's phone numbers, have some way of contacting them. I'm assuming most of you guys are doing it via Discord, so long as you have each other's contacts on Discord here, then you're set. But make sure you have that. Next up, make a dev gym. So this you can actually do during the jam. You don't necessarily need to do it before. But it's relatively easy to do, so you can set it up beforehand to save yourself some time. What a dev jam is, it's basically a dedicated space to test things out and experiment. So in the context of Unity, which if I'm not mistaken a lot of you are using, that would be basically having a dedicated scene to test things. So it would be like an empty scene with just a flat plane, and you can dump stuff in there. And that's what you use to kind of test things. This is very useful in general, but especially in a game jam since it allows you to work on things without directly modifying the game. This will be critical if a lot of people are working on the project directly, integrating their assets and putting things together all at the same time. As a rule, I always try to keep one gym per programmer at least. It can save a lot of headache in the long run since mistakes made in a gym won't break the rest of the game. This is also good training for working in the industry since we use a very similar concept when we're developing things professionally. Usually we have branches, but sometimes you have scenes depending on how big the project is. And by the way, gyms aren't exclusive to programmers. Level designers can make good use out of them. Artists can use them to test out shaders and lighting effects, and even sound designers can set up an environment to test their sound effects and music. Point is, don't try and do all of your test work in the final scene. That's kind of a recipe for disaster, especially if multiple people are all working on that final scene simultaneously. Set deadlines. Game jams are all about time management. A key to successfully completing a game jam is to properly distribute your time across the different tasks you need to perform. If you don't do this, chances are you'll find yourself scrambling to make your half-finished game work at the last hour. Usually because you wasted the first day or two thinking, we've still got plenty of time to figure things out. You don't. Not really anyway. A good way to get around that is simply to set deadlines for yourself. Once you go over that deadline, time to put your pencils down, make a decision, move on. So you can spend a lot of time trying to figure out certain things. And this is just kind of a good general rule for life is there's a certain point where you kind of need to stop and go, okay, we've been going around this subject for ages. It's time for us to just pin down a decision. Even if it's not the best, like, ideal thing, we need to figure something out because it's preventing us from continuing our work. And you will definitely feel that in a game jam environment because it's just so much faster. So this next part will be a bit different for you guys because it's not a 48-hour jam. Most of my advice is written with a 48-hour game jam in mind. But I know you guys have more time, so this can be different for you guys. But basically, I set up what I usually use whenever I do a game jam. I have kind of certain hours where I expect to have a certain thing done. And these function as my deadlines. So you could use these, you could modify them, adjust it to fit what your timeline looks like. And of course, it doesn't have to be identical to mine. This is just my example. But by the 5th hour into the jam, so after we started, by hour 5, we have a rough concept. So we roughly know what we're going to do. By hour 8, we finalize that concept. We have like a bit more of a solid idea of what it's going to be. And I've built something like a main menu, a gameplay scene, and a game over screen. So super basic skeletal stuff. By hour 10, we've confirmed that what we're trying to do is actually technically possible. And we've developed a task list so we know kind of what everyone needs to do for the next while. By hour 24, so a full day in, you have the basic gameplay loop and the core mechanics and assets made. So basically, you have everything to have like a very basic skeletal version of your game. By hour 30, you have an unpolished but playable first version. So that's kind of your first one where you can go, hey, look, I can actually show this off. By hour 40, you've polished that thing up until it actually looks decent. By hour 46, you have your submission pretty much set to go. So you have your zip file, everything that you need to kind of submit for your final thing, and a presentation. Assuming you guys are doing a presentation in this one, with a lot of game jams, you usually do have like a little bit where you present your jam game, or if not, you have your blurb for the submission page. By hour 47, you submit that final version. You want to do it an hour before the final submission time because you never know when something's not going to work. And then by hour 48, assuming you have that submitted final version, you have time to do a couple really last minute fixes and maybe submit another version. So these benchmarks are the ones that I use, and they're kind of on the aggressive side. So I wouldn't say it's a hard rule, especially not for your first jam. But I can say that in all the jams where I've kind of followed this system, it gives you a pretty good amount of comfort room to make your game as good as it can possibly be. There's nothing wrong with spending more time on any particular step if you need it, but it can get really easy to lose track of time while looking for the perfect idea or fiddling with the same platform for far too long. So just keep in mind the timeline in the back of your mind so that you aren't surprised by it at the end of the jam. So planning phase. So your team's all set up and you're ready to come up with a plan. The first hours are critical and will be a good indication of whether or not your game will be a success or not. So how do you plan like a pro? Scope your MVP. So there's a couple words in here, well, one word, one acronym, which I think are very kind of critical to pretty much any game development process, or most development processes, to be honest. So for those of you who aren't familiar with them, scope is basically just means how big and complex your project is going to be. Scoping is the process that is probably the most critical to any project, but it's especially essential for game jams. One of the biggest killers of any game jam game is having a scope that's too big. Being ambitious is good, but you need to know your limits. So how do you scope? The best place to start is by figuring an MVP. So no, by MVP, I don't mean most valuable player. What we use MVP for in the industry is minimum viable product. This term just means the most simple, basic version of what you want to build. Basically, if you have an MVP, you have a game. It might not be a very good-looking or well-performing game, but you have a game. And that's more than what a lot of teams finish up with. So this kind of example that you see here is a chart that we use to explain sort of how the MVP process is supposed to look. So some people will start developing, say, you're told to develop a car. So you start by making a wheel, then you make 2 wheels, then you have your chassis, and then you have the car. That's not really the way that we recommend, because what this means is you don't have a game, you don't have a game, you don't have a game, and then finally you have a game when everything comes together. Instead, what's recommended is make the simplest version of that game. So what's the simplest version of a car? A skateboard. And then you make it a little more complex. You add some extra stuff on there. Then you add a bit more. Then you add a bit more. And then eventually you end up with a car. But the nice thing is, at every step of that process, you have something that can technically be called a game. So you're kind of safe if, for whatever reason, you never get to that last step. You still have something that you can present. So set your initial scope with that objective in mind. Break down your ideas into their simplest forms that still make some sense. How quickly can you build that? Is it realistic given the time and resources you have? If you're not sure about the answers to those questions, it's probably no, so try going for something smaller and simpler. Of course, for some of you, this is your first game jam, so you might not really know how to do this yet, and that's fine. That comes with experience and practice. My recommendation is just start as small as you possibly can. For example, with a lot of game jams that I've done, my kind of trick is to figure out a super simple mechanic that I can build by the end of the first night. I then try and build that mechanic, and if it works and it's relatively fun, then we've completed 80% of the jam right there. And everything after that is polish. So to give you some examples, You Must Be This Tall to Ride is a game that I built basically on the concept of balancing 2 bodies. So pretty much you're supposed to be 2 kids in a trench coat who are balancing one on top of the other. And it's a co-op game where one person balances the top, the other person balances the bottom, and you try to get to the objective. We came up with this idea, and then I went and built it. Literally what I did is I just went into Unity, slapped 2 cubes, one on top of the other, just slapped those blocks, connected them, gave them a set of controls, and pretty much we were done. We had the concept, and from there we just needed to kind of make everything else. Of course, it would have been easier if we had an artist on the team, but all things considered, it came out really well. We were pretty happy with it. Meanwhile, To Error is Not Human, which is another game that I worked on for a jam. That was a game made purely just using voice recognition. So pretty much our first step was we figured out, can we do voice recognition and make it work reasonably well? We found out pretty early on that the answer was yes, and then we just kind of built a whole choice narrative around that. So super simple concept, and then we just kind of polished after that. And this doesn't just apply to my games, which are probably poor examples because they're not especially successful, but let me take one that is. Starwall, which some of you might have heard. I don't know if you have, but if you haven't, it was a pretty popular game for a while. And fun fact, I was actually there when it was made. It was made as one of the global game jams, and I happened to be in the same room as the guys who were doing it, sitting right next to them. And all they had for the idea is basically 2 characters that could rotate, had a heart on them, and a stabby bit. And so you could stab each other in the heart. Super simple concept. Literally, you just needed a couple floppy objects and some rotate mechanics. And it went on to be a very successful game. It got a whole bunch of awards, and literally that's because they took a very simple concept and they polished the heck out of it. So my recommendation to you is think about your game that way. Start with a super simple concept, think small, and then build up from there, because you can make a lot with something very minimal. Try new things, have a backup. As important as scope is to surviving in a game jam, that doesn't mean you can't push your boundaries. Actually, game jams are a wonderful place to experiment with new ideas and test things that you might not get a chance to try otherwise. I learned a whole lot of things from game jams just because I kind of experimented on things that I probably wouldn't have tried if I wasn't in that jam. So I learned dynamic sound integration, VR controls, voice commands. Those were just a few of the things that I learned. So to be perfectly clear, I'm not saying don't experiment. Absolutely do try some new stuff. But sometimes you'll come up with a cool idea, you'll try it out, and after several hours of what you thought was going to be, this is going to be simple, we'll do it and it'll just work, you find out that it doesn't, and you've pulled most of your hair out, and you find out that it's just not going to work. It happens, and that's why you should have a backup plan. So, Home is Where the Horde is another game jam game that I did, which used VR. So basically, all you were doing in that game is you were slapping slimes away from a treasure hoard. And it was simple enough. We thought, oh yeah, we just need to set up the VR controls, and from there we kind of build up and we polish this idea. However, we very nearly had to scrap it because I found out early on that I simply did not have the tech necessary to use the Oculus Rift that we had. Fortunately, we figured out a workaround a couple hours in, so we kind of got it to work within that time frame. But to be honest, we were lucky. I don't recommend relying on being lucky. I recommend on relying on being prepared. So in that event, we would have needed to figure out some sort of backup to use whatever assets were kind of being built while I figured out that maybe the Oculus wouldn't work. And honestly, you never know. Sometimes you can find a creative use for those resources that you have left over from your first idea. So, hey, let's say you were trying to make a gun, but you don't have any ammo for it. Well, slap a bayonet on it and use it as a spear. Honestly, some of the funniest and coolest game jam ideas I've seen have come out of trying to rework something that didn't work in the first place. Human needs are part of your scope. It can be tempting to say that you're going to pull all-nighters and work crazy hours to get the work done in time. Fortunately, I know that this jam is specifically made to be kind of stretched out, so you don't have to do that. But even in the ones where it's more constrained, like the 48-hour ones, I don't recommend it, even though I used to do this all the time. Basically, the kind of way that I worked is I would take the Monday and Friday off, and I would kind of stay up on the first night, pull an all-nighter, and get as much done as possible, and then take power naps throughout the rest of the jam. And then pretty much I managed to make that work by, because I took the Friday and the Monday off, I would just sleep through those entire days until it was time to do the jam. And then when the jam was done, I would just pass out and sleep for an entire day. I don't recommend doing that. It would completely mess up my sleep schedule, and once I got a 9-to-5 job rather than kind of the contract work that I had, it just did not work. I was way too exhausted for the week after, and even the week before. Plus, sometimes it would backfire, and I'd just be super sleepy and inefficient for the entire second half of the jam. So, yeah, I don't recommend it. Instead, what I recommend is the time you spend sleeping and eating, take that into account when you're setting up your scope. So count it in your plan. They're as important as any other task, if not more so. And frankly, normalizing a healthy jam schedule is something we all should do, because it's very similar to setting up a healthy work-life balance. You should just kind of make that a normal part of your thing, a normal expectation, because we don't want to encourage unhealthy habits. Have a list, check it twice. So once you have a general idea of what your game is going to be, it should be pretty easy to figure out what you'll need. That said, I've seen a lot of jammers just kind of jumping directly into building their game with no real plan. Sometimes this can be fine, especially if you've got a lot of experience, but I've seen a lot of people who do that and then find out in the last 4 hours or so that they completely forgot something super important. The solution to this is honestly really simple. Make a list. Put it somewhere that the entire team can see and update it as they progress. You can do this with a simple document, like you could put a Google Doc or a Word doc or something. You could use a project board like Trello. I've used Trello for a lot of my game jams, and it's worked really well. You literally just kind of have a setup like this, put your to-do, doing, and done. You have everyone update their things as they go, and that's it. Or if you want to be even more physical with it, you could use Post-its. It's even better if you can label them with priorities and other info for additional tracking. That's just good practice in general when you're trying to do any sort of project where you need to monitor things. So I definitely recommend it. And a game jam is a great way to kind of experiment with that and figure out what works for you, because not everyone works the same way. Assign responsibilities. So just like it's a good idea to have a task list, it's also a good idea to assign responsibilities in the team. For example, I used to do a lot of game jams as part of a team where I was one of two programmers. Often we would organize ourselves so that I handled everything that was related to the menus and point scoring, and the other guy handled things related to controls and characters. That way, each of us could work on a backlog without stepping on each other's toes, because most of our work didn't really interfere with each other. Likewise, our two artists on the team would usually split environment art and character art. So, how you divide the work can be up to your actual team. Of course, it's never going to be set in stone like this is the way you have to split it up. You figure out what works best for you guys. But setting up these types of divisions does definitely help to ensure that you don't accidentally duplicate or forget work. And of course, if one person finishes their work early, they can always go pick up from the other person's pile. So you've got your idea down, you know what you need to do. Now it's time to actually make your game. You've planned everything out, so surely nothing can go wrong, right? Wrong. The very first thing to keep in mind is that if something can go wrong in a game jam, it will. Because game jams are so short and so high pressure, mistakes and oversights happen. You can't get around it. No matter how much you prepare, there's something that's probably going to go wrong. Sometimes it's small, sometimes it's big, but something will definitely go wrong. To give you an example, I once did a jam at a camp, a summer camp, and their power supply wasn't actually able to handle all the computers set up at the venue. So we ended up having a blackout. Everyone ended up running their computers on portable generators that they had. So they brought out these generators. We were all plugged in. It was really jank. And our team's generator broke down several more times over the course of the jam, which was really screwing us up. So honestly, stuff happens. Sometimes it's a technical issue, sometimes it's a personal one. There's a lot that can go wrong in just a few hours. So my kind of big takeaway from that is that game jams are stressful, and it's important that you know that going in and be mentally prepared to handle the unexpected. Sometimes you'll be able to get through it with some clever solutions and or sheer tenacity. Sometimes you won't, and your team will crash and burn. And that's okay. Game jams are meant to be a learning experience, and you can learn a lot from those failures. So just keep that in mind and don't get too worked up over it. I've seen people kind of break down during a game jam because something's happened and oh no, it's all gone terribly and now we're in a bad spot. And yeah, it sucks. It genuinely does, but you kind of have to remember that it's just a game jam. So don't stress too much. It's one of experience of many, and you'll have many other opportunities. So take it in stride. Prioritize aggressively. So speaking of stress, one of the easiest ways to avoid being stressed, especially in the final hours of a jam, is to make sure you keep your priorities in order. You wouldn't believe how many game jams I've seen where a team will start with the optional cosmetic stuff and then leave building the actual game for the end. And to me, that just seems like a great way to turn your hair white prematurely. So instead, what I recommend is I've got basically two questions. So anytime you're trying to figure out what to work on next, ask yourself these two questions. First off, do I need this for the game to function? In other words, is this part of the MVP, the minimum viable product that I mentioned? And two, do my teammates need this to do their work? So am I blocking someone, basically? If the answer to either of these questions is yes, then you should probably deal with that first. If it's yes to both, then you should definitely do that first. Everything where the answer to both of these is no is quite frankly fluff, and you can do that after when you reach the polish stage and you've done all the things where the answer to these is yes. Quality over quantity. So I've seen a lot of game jam participants get really ambitious with how much content they want to make. I'm talking multiple big sprawling levels, or kind of like a big open world thing, or a whole bunch of different features and modes. Something to remember is that the people who will be looking at and judging your game will only really be seeing it for a few minutes. This isn't some kind of big AAA thing that you're publishing for mass distribution. It's a game jam game. So when someone looks at it, chances are they're going to come in, they'll look at what they see, and then they move on. So likewise, the chances are that if you're making something that has a lot of content, they simply aren't going to see most of that content. And as far as they're concerned, if they don't see it, it doesn't exist, no matter how much time you've put into it. So focus your energy on making a vertical slice. Vertical slice is a concept that we use in the industry that basically refers to a small focused experience that's very deep, as opposed to a horizontal slice, which is a broad, shallow experience. So go for a vertical one, something small, focused, deep. A single, very pretty and well-made level will, with only a couple really tight mechanics, will always beat out several kind of meh levels and a whole bunch of buggy mechanics. So I said it a moment ago, but it bears repeating. If you can't see it, it doesn't exist. Game jams are very forward-facing experiences. The vast majority of the time, people aren't really going to look at how things work behind the scenes or take the time to uncover all the content you made. They're going to look at what they see right in front of them, interact with that for a few minutes, and then leave. Presentation will often trump substance in jams, and you can use this to your advantage. So say in your game there's a volcano in the distant background that's kind of there for effect. Don't bother modeling the whole thing. Just model the part that they'll see. Or better yet, get a 2D image and slap some lighting effects on it. Save yourself some time by cutting corners, because you'll realize that there's a lot of corners you can cut when you realize just how many details people are ignoring. Pour all of that extra time you save from that into the things that are going to be in people's faces. Put that into your character, the stuff that they're immediately interacting with. So prioritize everything that your audience will actually see and slapdash everything else. That is the essence of making a good game jam game. It's also what we in the industry call efficiency. Efficiency really is the name of the game in game jams, and one very simple and effective way to significantly boost your efficiency is templates or building blocks. So consider most of the games you've seen, and just how many things in those games are basically just slightly modified versions of the same thing. What, at the end of the day, a Lego block is just kind of a rectangle with a little peg and a hole at the bottom, and you can then multiply these in multiple sizes. Let me take an example that's more kind of video gamey. So let's take a classic first-person shooter soldier type enemy. Now say you add 4 adjustable values. You put health, speed, attack range, and fire rate. Even if you only have kind of 2 thresholds for each, you can now make a whole bunch of different types of enemies. And let me give you an example of that. Don't know if any of you guys are familiar with TF2, but if you are, this might ring true. These guys are basically all the same character with just modifications to health, speed, attack range, and fire rate. So even if you only kind of do a small change like that, you have a lot of variety that you gain access to. So just having a base with a few tweaks, you can do a lot more than, say, if you rebuild from scratch each time, and you can do it a lot faster. So try and keep that in mind. You can build templates for things and then just add a couple modifiers on there to make a lot more than if you're trying to build everything from scratch. And this logic can be extended to a lot of things, even across game jams. So depending on how much you're allowed to carry over, of course, you might be able to take some things and use them from one jam to another. For instance, I did this with basically the menu system that we used in a lot of jams that I participated in. Pretty much, I kind of set up this thing where I had a very simple intro page with a couple basic menu buttons that when you hit it, you went into the game, and then I just had a generic condition that when this is triggered, it would bring you to a game over win or fail screen. And I set that up for one game, and then I kind of copied it, saved it as a template, and then I used that as the setup for a whole bunch of other games. So all of these games are basically using the same menu structure. It wasn't anything fancy, but it did save me a solid hour of building an intro and game over page and those basic menu controls each time. And that hour, I was able to use it on making all of those games better in other ways. So there's a lot of little kind of victories you can do with that. And over time, as you kind of build up these things, you can make a lot of templates that you can then kind of take advantage of. Always be communicating. So it should probably be obvious, but unless you're working solo, game jams are a team sport. And you don't win team sports by having everyone hide in their corner and never interacting with each other. As a team, you need to be in constant communication. Let people know what you're working on and what you'll need from your teammates. Check in on what your teammates are doing so that they're all on the same page. Ask your teammates for help and get their perspective on what you're doing. These are all useful interactions that you should be doing regularly over the course of the jam. And even if it's not directly in service of the game you're working on, just chat with each other from time to time. Social interaction builds the bond between your team, and you can make other interactions go more smoothly as a result. Plus, it's a way to manage your stress and have fun, which should be one of the main objectives you have while you're making your game, is to have fun. We, as humans, are social animals, and we work best when we're interacting with others. So try and keep that in mind. Don't just kind of sit in your corner and not talk with the rest of your team. Speaking of communication, build a common vocabulary. A little detail that can easily be forgotten is that not all of us always use the same standards or words in our work. So to give you an example, during one jam, I asked one of my teammates to give me some graphical assets, and I sent him the dimensions I needed for them. A few hours later, I received the images, only to realize that they were all severely distorted. We realized the problem pretty quickly. I'd been using pixels in my measurements, and he had been using points. This meant that we had to go and revise all of his images to fit properly with our pixel-based resolution. This is something that could have been easily avoided if we had just made sure we were using the same units of measurement in the first place. I also have a funny example when it comes to language. So for those of you who don't know, Ubisoft has a lot of French people working in it. And at one point, I was working with some people and we got a kind of team-wide message about changing some things in Confluence, which is kind of our internal wiki. And he was warning, basically, the objective was to tell us not to keep any sensitive information because it was going to be shared outwards. And the email that I got about this had this message: if you have sensible information, please remove it from Confluence before Friday. So that got me chuckling quite a bit when I first heard it, because sensible is actually the word sensible, which is the French word for sensitive. The guy was French, didn't know what the actual translation was, so he just kind of used what he thought was the logical thing. But turns out languages don't work that way. So this was kind of not too serious and was more just chuckle-worthy. But you can see how just a single word can significantly change the meaning of something. Let me use a few other examples. So platform. Is a platform a flat surface that you walk on? Or is it the hardware you're running the game on? When you say running, do you mean the game is running or the character? Is HP a measure of your health, a brand of printer, or a delicious brown sauce? Silly as it might seem, try to keep this sort of thing in mind when you communicate with each other. It will save you some trouble down the road, because you never know when one of these little kind of accidents will turn into something much more confusing. And something to add specifically for programmers is when it comes to variable names. This is one of the spots where I think it's actually the most serious, because I've done a lot of jams where I've worked with people that don't know how to name their variables. And that can be a huge factor in saving a lot of time. In general, my advice is try to name your values in a way that makes them easy for everyone to read and understand, not just you. It can save a lot of headache in the long run. And frankly, it's just good general practice. So, for example, I've done jams where I've had or even actual projects and business things where I've had people write variables and just had like super obscure names. Like I looked at DAG and it's like, what's a DAG? I have no idea. It was supposed to be a dagger, but they just shortened it to DAG with no context. And things like this where maybe I'll see it in the code, I'll wonder what it is, and I'll have to take the time to go through the code to figure out what it is, or go and bother the guy to ask, what does this mean? And that could have very simply been avoided if the things were just named what they're supposed to be. Go with simpler is better, but always make sure that it's descriptive without being too vague. That's kind of my advice in general for programming. Good life advice in general. Just name your things in a way that is clear. Keep track of things. So in all the chaos of a game jam, it can be really easy to forget about things. That's why I suggested that you make your list and that you always stay in communication so that you avoid that sort of problem. You really don't want surprises near the end of a jam just because everyone kind of forgot about something. That's one of the biggest sources of stress that I've seen. A lot of people panic near the end when they find out, oh no, we totally forgot about this. So ideally, you might have someone on your team who's kind of the designated project manager, looking over everyone's work and making sure that all the important tasks are being completed when they need to be. If not, then sort of everyone on your team has to have a certain responsibility to check up on the task list. Be careful not to fall into the trap of, oh, but I thought you were taking care of that. Oh, I thought you were taking care of that. And turns out no one was taking care of that. Save your work. Save, save, save. I can't count the number of times I've seen people in jams despair because they didn't save and suddenly their computer crashed or something else happened and that caused them to lose hours worth of progress. Save often. Make backup saves. Put your stuff in a shared location so that even if your computer dies, someone can download it and continue. Just save. That's good advice for a game jam. That's good advice for any project you ever work on. Save. I can't stress it enough. Prepare a presentation. So in the vast majority of game jams, and I don't actually know in the case of this one, but I'm assuming there'll be something near the end where you show your game off to people. It can be judges, fellow participants, or even the general public in some cases. Point is, you're likely going to be showing off your game. So with that in mind, most jams expect you to do kind of a little presentation or write a blurb to put on a website. Most people consider this step kind of an afterthought and neglect it in favor of spending that time on their game. This, I think, is kind of a mistake. So unless you're a pro improviser, and let's be honest, very, very, very few people are, it's a good idea to prepare a little something ahead of time. Maybe about half a day before the final deadline, because game jams put so much emphasis on presentation. Like I said, it's a very forward-facing thing. This is your opportunity to direct the audience's attention. Highlight the best part of your game, and hide or gloss over the broken and unfinished bits. A good presentation will do wonders for how the audience will look at and experience your game, and it can make a huge difference in terms of how it's evaluated. While requiring relatively little effort, you don't need to do much to make a good presentation that will really highlight your game compared to the effort that would be needed to make your game that much better. Stay in touch. So I'm willing to bet that when this jam is over, a lot of you out there are going to talk to your teammates about how your game could actually be really great if you put in just a little more work, and you all agree that you should stay in touch and get back together to finish the job one of these days. I can also tell you that about 95% of you will never actually do that. And many of you will probably never talk to each other again, other than maybe to wish each other happy birthday on Facebook every year. And I can say that from experience because literally when I was writing that line, that's what I was doing. Honestly, there are very few game jam games that are worth revisiting after the jam. There are some, just not many. The people you meet as part of a jam, however, nothing is more important in the video game industry, or any industry for that matter, as connections. And no connection is stronger than the bond forged by going through trials together. And game jams are a trial, believe me. Game jams give you a unique insight into how your teammates work and behave under pressure, and what they're capable of when they push themselves. That knowledge is invaluable. And likewise, you have the opportunity to show off your skills and abilities to your teammates. Keep track over the course of the jam of the people that you worked well with, and keep their contact info on hand. You never know when they'll come up again. Say you'll have another jam in the future, and oh yeah, I remember I worked really well with this guy. Let me get in touch with him again. And even when we're talking about kind of going into the industry, I've personally given a lot of referrals to people that I've done game jams with. And I don't give out a lot of referrals. I kind of have a policy I won't refer anyone that I haven't worked with personally. But if I've worked with you on a game jam and I've seen what you can do and I know that you're capable of working well under those conditions, I know that you can probably work well under any other condition. So I'll be much more inclined to recommend you in that situation. So keep that in mind, because you never know when someone you've worked with will end up being in a position where they can help you out, or vice versa. It's something to keep in mind. And that's it. Well, not really. I could probably list off a dozen more suggestions, but there's only so much time, and I need to focus on using it efficiently. See what I did there? Hopefully, some of these tips will help you on your journey. Most likely, you'll have to learn many of them firsthand before they really sink in. But that's what game jams are for. So above all, learn and have fun. If you do that, then no matter what kind of game you put out, no matter how it turns out, every game jam you do will be a success. So with that, I wish you the best of luck, and thank you for listening. I've put some contact info here. Of course, I'm happy to share it, and I will be putting a version of this presentation, kind of a scripted rendition, up on my website in the near future, if ever you want to kind of go look at the slides or whatever. But for now, I believe we might have some time for questions.